All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Alex Trembath, Deputy Director of the Breakthrough Institute. Welcome, Alex.
Richard, thanks so much for having me.
So we've got a lot to get into, but just so we can give our listeners a little background, give us like the 30-second background of what the Breakthrough Institute is.
Sure. The Breakthrough Institute is a think tank with offices in Berkeley and Washington, D.C., and we are focused on technological solutions to environmental problems. Classic example is clean energy, low carbon energy technology as a solution to the environmental problem of climate change. And that's as a sort of alternative to the conventional understanding, I think, of environmental problems that I'm sure we'll get into in our conversation, which are problems that we need to deal with through regulation or through self-sacrifice or through scaling back or through degrowth or things like that. Breakthrough is one of the organizations dedicated to a sort of more optimistic technological approach to dealing with environmental problems.
All right, well, that's a great intro because I know you often describe your work as being part of an eco-modernist outlook. And not everyone might be familiar with that term yet, although a lot of people certainly have an image in their head of what a plain old regular environmentalist looks like. But you recently wrote last December that environmental activists are kind of full of shit, end quote. What does that mean? What is wrong with the traditional environmentalist outlook on stuff?
Great prompt, Richard. Yeah, so eco-modernism is a sort of school of thought that we, really sort of cultivated at the Breakthrough Institute. We are not the only eco-modernists, and we're not in charge or by any stretch, but we certainly helped sort of formally launch the project with the publication of an eco-modernist manifesto in 2015, and have continued to sort of shepherd it as a school of thought. So eco-modernism, I think, is thought of best as a kind of reformist environmentalism. We think that environmentalism gets one big important thing right, which is that humans should care about nature. And it's an important and I think actually not self-evident claim. If you look back across, especially the last couple centuries, I think it's totally plausible to conclude that humans cannot care about nature and can thrive. That's largely what has happened. That's very, very sort of arguably what has happened as more of nature has been taken over for human purposes, mostly sort of agriculture and cities. There are many fewer species and many fewer wild animals and many more domesticated animals now. And humans, by and large, are larger in numbers, more prosperous, more free, more resilient than we were before that. So it's not, I think, self-evident that we should care about nature, but eco-modernists agree with environmentalists that we should care about nature. But we also think that's about the only thing that conventional environmentalism gets right in its sort of philosophy and in its projects. And it gets a whole bunch of other really important things wrong. So contra environmentalism, nature is not some fragile, delicate, pristine thing. Humans do not, nor should we think, live in harmony with nature. Humans are special, actually. Humans are not just sort of upright apes that are part of nature and need to harmonize with it. But we are actually sort of special, both sort of existential and moral agents. Organic is not always or even reliably superior to the technological or the synthetic. There are no fundamental biophysical constraints on human well-being imposed by Earth systems or Gaia or nature or anything like that. So how a bunch of those premises show up in modern institutional environmentalism varies, but I think those are actually pretty consistent commitments of the environmentalist project. A bunch of the pushing back on those bad ideas has come from elsewhere. Sort of like Prometheans and meliorists, and libertarians, deontologists. A bunch of these other philosophical traditions have pushed back on the really wrong notions in conventional environmentalism, and eco-modernists borrow a bunch of those really solid sort of critiques and philosophies. I think what makes eco-modernism sort of most revolutionary is our assertion that sort of technological and human achievement can actually protect both nature and humans. So as we grow as a species, both sort of in numbers and economically, as we innovate, as we deploy new technologies, as we build infrastructure, we're not only making ourselves more prosperous and resilient, but we can actually protect nature too.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I like the metaphor. I don't think I've heard before of us being sort of a reformist movement within environmentalism. So if mainstream environmentalism is the Roman Catholic Church, then you are like the Martin Luther coming along and reforming it. I'm not sure what they'd make of that analogy, but I think it's interesting. Um, and I think this really comes down to uh kind of a fundamental question about what is the human relationship to nature. And you said maybe it's not self-evidently obvious that human beings should care about nature, but we think they should for various reasons. That this is I put this in something I wrote a couple of years ago, that the main reason for, I think, kind of the first phase of environmentalism, or like old school environmentalism, the sort of like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. The idea is that, well, we want nature to be good for us and our descendants, not because of some uh, sort of disembodied idea that nature off by itself with no human beings would somehow be better, right? That like the perfect Earth for I think the really extreme side of the environmentalist movement is say, well, there should be no human beings at all. Human beings are always bad. They're always pollution. They are pollution in and of themselves. They don't just produce pollution. And that, perfect harmony would be zero human beings and just, insects and plants and animals just kind of boogieing out on their own without us. Um, I don't think that would be a great world. I think human beings are actually pretty good. And so there's this tension between, do we want to protect environmental equality for us as human beings, or do we want to protect environmental equality from us as human beings? Because if you take as a premise that the best possible world is one with no human beings, then that's kind of a troubling direction for every other policy you might be in favor of, it seems like.
Yeah, and it gets to, I think, a bunch of pretty actually messy thinking in the environmentalist movement, which can sort of, I think, often wobble back and forth between a couple of different ways of thinking about the human nature relationship. So breaking it down a little bit, one way to think about humans, technology, and nature is that humans are just upright apes or a part of nature. We need to harmonize with it. We protect both ourselves and nature, not by sort of building these cities and splitting atoms and turning photons into electrical current, but by being a part of these natural Earth systems and using ecosystem services as opposed to technological infrastructure. And that is the right human nature relationship. Another is that nature is just sort of raw material for human well-being. It's basically just infrastructure. Human societies use it just for our purposes, and the sort of either sort of existence value or sort of ecosystem services of wild non-human nature, have no sort of moral weight at all. I think eco-modernism provides a kind of third way between those two ways of thinking about humans, technology, and nature, which is that we want to decouple human well-being from both dependence on and destruction of wild nature. So as we move from as we move sort of higher up the energy ladder from bioenergy, sort of wood and biomass towards fossil fuels, we burn down fewer forests for heating and industry. And that energy ladder goes up and up towards things like solar and nuclear that allow us to preserve even more of that raw material. So we protect nature not by being in harmony with it, and we don't just need the sort of forests and grasslands as raw material for humans, but we can actually decouple through technological innovation our destruction of nature and think of nature more and more, if not sort of entirely, but more and more as a garden that we can tend. It does provide, sort of food and raw material, but there are also, sort of big parts of the natural world that we want to preserve, both for our purposes and national parks and sort of hunting and fishing and things like that, depending on who's using what part of the landscape, but also for its own existence value. We want to protect the tigers, not because tigers provide some essential service to humans, some essential raw material, but because we want them to exist as a part of this beautiful world that humans are on.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely like to see more giant panda bears out there, and I must admit they offer the essential value of cuteness, but not a lot of practical value. So we can absolutely value them for a sort of non-economic reason. So a lot of us have been writing about, I think probably both of us, what we call the abundance agenda. So that's a set of policy goals and sort of policy reforms that would lead to more abundant supplies of things like food and housing and energy. And it would require repealing or changing a lot of current laws and policies in places like the United States. What has been the reaction, as someone I know who's like been talking about this stuff, what are the reactions you've gotten to talking to new audiences about this and bringing this up, and having this as being a way of looking at public policy through the lens of abundance?
I think the sort of abundance agenda and sort of how it manifests in different factions, whether that's sort of state capacity libertarianism or supply side progressivism, which I think are all in the same sort of family of ideas. Sort of more abundant, affordable food, energy, services, infrastructure. I think that's a sort of a wildly appealing, attractive idea to most people, and not to environmentalists, which I think is a really sort of crucial and stark distinction. I think an abundance-oriented institution like Breakthrough or individual like myself would say that we can have hyper-abundant energy with nuclear and solar and geothermal. We can have sort of even cheaper and more abundant and hyper-productive food systems than we do today. I mean, the U.S. food system, sort of wildly regarded as ecologically ruinous by the environmental movement, actually has sort of the lowest water, pesticide, land use implications per calorie of almost any food system in the world. We're sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 times more productive in growing grains and in producing protein than most other countries. And if the rest of the world produced food like the U.S. did, then we would actually spare a bunch of land for wild nature. So, I think those are really sort of tractable, powerful ideas. But what the sort of conventional environmentalist rejoinder is that we have to tighten our belts, that Earth is finite, that there are sort of these fundamental, quote, planetary boundaries within which human societies need to exist and cannot exceed, whether that's 450, 550 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere, or how much synthetic nitrogen we are generating through Haber-Bosch and putting into plants, or sort of local and global boundaries on water consumption or phosphorus consumption or things like that. The claim of environmentalism has always been that there's too many of us, we're consuming too much, we're growing too fast, and we're eventually going to break sort of Earth systems at a global level. And I think, we've published a bunch of empirical research on this. There's just no evidence that any of that is true, that we have been learning since at least Malthus, if not long before, that that human societies are about to break some sort of fundamental natural law beyond which we will not be able to continue to grow and to prosper, and that keeps not being the case. And environmentalists keep finding new ways to insist that it is. And so I think that the sort of abundance agenda remains both a sort of an empirical disagreement that eco-modernists and other folks like yourself have with environmentalists, but also a political one. I think all the evidence just over any time period, but just look over the past few years where we've had supply chain disruptions and energy price spikes. The notion that scarcity breeds solidarity, or is a sort of attractive political project, is just belied by really sort of every instance of scarcity in sort of memorable history, up to and including the pandemic and its after effects. So I think abundance is really sort of both feasible and attractive, and a way to protect both human societies and nature. And I think that it is much more appealing, sort of as a socio-political project, at least outside of conventional environmentalism, which is one of the reasons that we think eco-modernism needs to exist in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point about the political realities of scarcity, which I know breakthrough people have written about a lot, which is, I think, a little underappreciated. The idea that when you get more increased demand for fewer resources, that generally breeds instability and conflict, not a sort of, I think some people imagine a sort of a kind of cottage core simplistic life where everyone lives in sort of a semi-rural commune, and everyone does a gift exchange with handicrafts and things like that, and that if you live like that, then that would be, well, that would be like fewer industrial processes and fewer material used, and we would all live in a sort of like, happy cooperative environment. But I think in the real world, when you are when either exogenous forces impoverish people, or there's some other enforced scarcity, human beings, unfortunately, tend to be more like aggressive rats in a box that's too small, which is not particularly living in harmony. So if there was more real world evidence of the cottagecore kumbaya version, we might we might take it more seriously, but there isn't. So I think we need to be very careful about saying, oh well, everything will be better if we just learn to live with less. And by the way, some political authority is going to force everyone to live with less.
Yeah, a couple of things on that. One, we can have, I think, a good faith debate about excess consumption, where mega yachts, or taking the private jet to the grocery store or something like that. But first of all, that's not sort of a sort of tier of consumption that almost anyone is faced with around the world. Something like 85% of humanity has never set foot on a plane, let alone contemplated taking the private jet to the grocery store. So I think that that's a sort of marginal argument to have. Underneath that, though, this sort of cottage core sort of harmony with nature imaginary, it uses more resources. If we all sort of ate organic, and we all produced our own sort of kitchen tables and clothes, we would use more raw material from nature. We use more land to grow our food, because we're not using sort of modern productive technologies, inputs, and processes like synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and mechanized agriculture. I have no idea how to make my clothes, and if I tried, not only would I waste a bunch of my time and spend really all my time growing my food and producing goods for myself and my neighbors, as opposed to producing sort of hopefully higher value economic output. But I would use more resources. I would waste more resources in doing so. So even if that it was sort of politically possible to get to a state where everyone is fine, not getting their stuff from Amazon or getting their food from Safeway, it would actually be more economically ruinous, especially at the scale of sort of population that we have in the world today. And so I think that is a sort of really under recognized, just sort of empirical truth about the sort of relative outputs of different types of production systems. But again, to your other point, we're not even going to get close to getting to that sort of bucolic cottagecore degrowth world. Again, because we see how sort of mass publics react to constraints and to scarcity and to higher prices. I found it just kind of appalling and very telling. About 3 years ago exactly, when lockdown started in earnest in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, you immediately had a bunch of sort of environmentalists pointing to these lockdowns as an important template for dealing with climate change. They were like, look around, like, look what we can do when we feel really motivated. We can stop going out, we can shut down bars and restaurants and schools, we can shut down factories, we can stop flying on planes. And this is how we should be responding to climate change. We should be emitting less, we should be doing less, we should living more locally, we should, carbon emissions went down like less than 10% globally in 2020 compared to 2019, and they're now higher than they were in 2019. So first of all, not at all effective in terms of just reducing carbon emissions in an emergency style footing like we had with the lockdowns. But secondly, people hated lockdown. I certainly hated lockdown. Even the people who were really pro-lockdown, I think would be hard pressed not to admit that it was psychologically and socially very damaging, and in many cases really the right thing to do in response to a new pathogen, but certainly not something that could be sustained for years or decades, as would have to be the case to lower carbon emissions or to deal with climate change or sort of overconsumption or overpollution through something like a lockdown. So again, I think it's both sort of just politically dead on arrival, an obvious truth that I think environmentalists continue to deny. But then even if you achieved it, the effects of sort of lower productivity commerce would be larger in aggregate than the increasingly efficient and productive and dematerialized economic system that we have today.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you saw even in communist China, a literal totalitarian country, even they had to eventually abandon their zero COVID lockdown policy. It was unsustainable even for them on the space of even a few years, much less the idea that we should somehow re-engineer society around a sort of quasi lockdown policy for climate change purposes. And well, environmentalists, might say, oh well, if you don't consider yourself environmentalist, that means that you're undervaluing this sort of impossible to quantify value of nature. I think it's also possible that if you believe in climate lockdowns, you're undervaluing this difficult to value thing we call human freedom as well. There are sort of there are certain ways, certain policies in which they, it might seem rational to have a certain economic policy if you didn't care about nature at all. But it's also possible to have environmental policy that's equally terrible if you don't care about human freedom at all.
Yeah, and first of all, for understandable reasons, humans are always going to care by and large about human interests before those of the frogs and the dandelions. But secondly, once again, I think that environmentalists get this sort of value of nature question really, really wrong. So, the claim of the School of Ecological Economics, which, it comes out of sort of radical environmental economists in the 1960s and 70s, is that, all of human well-being is based on raw materials from nature and ecosystem services, and that and what we need to do is we need to place a dollar value on every river and every tree that expirates oxygen, and sort of every sort of grassland that provides feed for cattle and things like that. And I think what we see from that is an exploitation of nature, not a saving of nature. When nature has economic value to humans, we use it. When it is valuable to cut down a forest for construction materials or for bioenergy, we do that. And we save that forest by not needing to cut it down, by moving from wood to concrete and steel and cement, or moving from wood to oil, or for shipping and heating and things like that. Obviously, there are rebound effects, and the sort of totality of the human technological enterprise has grown. I don't want to suggest that we have just saved nature by innovating and decoupling over the centuries, but we have used less and less of it on a relative and per capita basis over time. And thus, the implication of that, I think, is not to sort of rewind the clock and return to a less prosperous or less technologically advanced society, but to keep pushing that decoupling lever ever forward.
That's good. Now, there's another thing I think is sort of important here, that came up recently. I noticed in the New York Times, Ezra Klein had a interesting column that a lot of people are talking about. Is the idea of wanting every government policy or even every government licensed private project to solve multiple problems simultaneously. So Ezra called this the problem with everything bagel liberalism. So he cited examples of affordable housing construction in San Francisco, and then microchip plants, the kind of factories that are going to be subsidized by the CHIPS Act that passed last year, where government policy requires so many different goals to be prioritized during a project that it jeopardizes making any progress on that at all. What do you think about this phenomenon where, like, in order to build, you can build new housing, but you have to use only union labor, and you have to use only made in America products, and you have to hire certain minority subcontractors, and then you also have to provide on-site daycare, and you have to do 10 other things, meaning the project maybe gets so complicated it doesn't get built.
I thought it was a really great column. I'll be interested to see where the everything bagel liberalism metaphor goes and scales, since I think it depends on a very close reading of the film Everything Everywhere All at Once, where the everything bagel becomes a black hole, which I think is a really powerful metaphor if you're super familiar with both Everything Bagels and that movie. Look, I'm slightly more sort of sympathetic, I think, to everything bagel liberalism than you might expect, or you might be, Richard, simply because policies are not designed in a vacuum, and some amount of log rolling and horse trading is necessary, both to get laws passed and to get motions passed and measures passed, and to get and to get development projects moved up the queue. So I think that we're not probably going to live in the sort of libertarian utopia, where there are sort of no regulations or no standards attached to development projects, or sort of measures attached to laws in order to qualify for government grants or things like that. So some amount of that kind of friction is both kind of inevitable, and I think at times salutary. I think the problem that Ezra identifies is not treating that the sort of everything sprinkling on top of the bagel as a unavoidable friction, but as kind of the goal. The goal, I think, of not just environmentalists, but progressive politics generally, these days is to use sort of technological and infrastructural and even sort of targeted social policies just as vessels for, as Ezra puts it, everything else. So, the affordable housing project that he talks about in his column for chronically homeless people in San Francisco becomes a vessel for not just union construction labor, but union construction labor in the city of San Francisco, who had a problem with the prefabricated housing units built in a union factory 20 miles away in Vallejo. It becomes a vessel for sort of the broader social and homelessness sort of progressive project. And we see this all over the place with really all discussions of technological, infrastructural, and social development, which are at this point, I think, so weighed down with these requirements and with these stipulations or with these regulations that we've completely lost the forest for the trees, and are becoming sort of increasingly unable to actually build anything. This is the fundamental critique of the abundance agenda. And you could say, look, like a sort of requirement that this project get all of its supplies from sort of X contractor, or that this developer provides X services in order to get the government grant. You could say that those are good sort of workforce training or labor force development, or sort of responsible supply chain management, or good social policy. But as Ezra, I think, rightly points out, if those requirements slow considerably or very often stop the development from happening at all, you are not advancing growth, prosperity, resilience, or justice. Sort of affordable housing, affordable energy, affordable food. These are also sort of justice and equity accelerating projects themselves. And so I think that is what is missed by sort of everything bagel liberalism, which is that infrastructure, technology, housing, energy, food, that these are merely vessels for, frankly, sort of nonprofit actors who are interested in selling their services to the developer or to the government or whatever, as opposed to these are the end themselves. We want more housing, we want more abundant food, we want cheaper energy, and those actually provide positive economic outcomes, including for especially for the most marginalized people in society. And so I think that, we could probably go back and forth, just you and me, Richard, on what amount of everything bagel topping is appropriate or is acceptable in sort of liberal society. But when it becomes the goal, not just the sort of friction to achieve the goal, I think that is the problem that Ezra sort of rightly identifies.
All right. Yeah, we can come back and have a 3-hour symposium on whether you want more sesame seeds or more poppy seeds on your government contracting requirements. So here's an interesting thing. This came up actually when I was at Breakthrough's Eco-Modernism conference last year, which was a fine event, by the way. And I think if any listeners want to, they can look up the sessions on the internet archived. But so one of the most this hot topics at that event last year was permitting reform and the National Environmental Policy Act, which we call NEPA. I personally think NEPA would be an adorable name for a baby girl. If you're like a government planner and you're gonna have a daughter, I think NEPA would be a great name. But pretty much everyone there was in favor of reforming NEPA so that more big new projects can go forward, including things like renewable energy projects. But I kind of sensed an interesting sort of tension there, which didn't really become a discussion point among people, but I was thinking about it. So some people who were at that event were extremely experienced. They were attorneys. They were very experienced in regulatory compliance, and they had worked with the NEPA process and done all the paperwork for decades. And a lot of them seem to be in a sort of a amend it, don't end it outlook, in which they were amenable to some reforms, but maybe not too much change. And then a lot of people who actually probably had much less professional experience with it were more likely to be the sort of radicals and say, no, no, we just need to get rid of entirely, slash and burn, repeal it, so forth. In a lot of environments, we might say, well, the person with more experience, maybe we should defer to them because they know the system better. But I think maybe that's a mistake here. Because maybe it's the people with more experience, maybe too close to the issue to really be judging it dispassionately, or it may be more difficult for them to imagine a world in which it doesn't exist, even if that world might be better, or a world in which their 30 years of professional experience is suddenly less valuable because it doesn't exist. What do you think about that sort of incremental versus, tear the band-aid off versus incremental reform, but also the kind of, it's almost kind of a public choice issue where the where a person sits in their professional outlook is inevitably going to color to some extent how they feel about these issues.
Yeah, and I don't think you have to choose. I think that sort of both things are happening at once, and that is the precise difficulty, not just of the permitting reform conversation, where we think we're trying, people in Congress are trying, I'm trying, a bunch of organizations are trying to advance at least some piecemeal reforms to NEPA and other environmental regulatory laws. But it's the problem of, just to zoom out a moment, it's the problem of sort of post-scarcity modernity generally, where we have dematerialized the economy. We have largely built out the sort of energy, transit, food infrastructure required to get people around and heat their homes and feed people. And so now there is just a huge amount of sort of social and economic activity dedicated to just maintaining the system, as opposed to building it. And that creates a different kind of politics. It creates different kinds of business models, both in government, in nonprofit, and in the sort of business world. And it creates different kinds of public choice problems, as you identify, I think rightly. On the one hand, the sort of folks who work at Council on Environmental Quality or who do NEPA compliance at government agencies, or the environmental lawyers who work for developers, they know that if you somehow repealed NEPA, if Ron DeSantis repeals NEPA on, January 30th, 2025, then according to them, it would create chaos, right? Because then there were the sort of known institutions for moving things forward, albeit at a glacial, kludgy, highly frustrating pace, would have vanished, and we wouldn't know what to do. And I buy that to a significant degree. At the same time, that is the definition of a vested interest. It's a vested interest in the process as it exists today. And if we think, as I do, that the process is deeply flawed, then what I think we need to do is recognize that that we may not want to abolish NEPA over the course of a couple months or even a couple years, but we need to not just do what Joe Manchin proposed doing, I think for good reason, last summer, which is to make some, fairly important, but also fairly marginal sort of reforms around the edges of environmental review. We need a sort of positive feedback loop of regulatory de-ratcheting that rewards itself over time, and that causes sort of NEPA, for instance, not to necessarily be abolished overnight, but to be continuously reformed and pared back and made more tractable and useful over time. And it's the example that always comes to mind for me these days is the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement, which didn't say that we are going to abolish zoning nationally. And it didn't say that we are going to that we're going to do zoning reform either nationally or at the local level once. It said that we are going to confront the problem of exclusionary zoning and of other limits to building, housing, and sort of other commercial activity, and we're going to keep whacking at that problem. We're gonna keep coming back to it, and that is the kind of political approach and orientation that I think permitting reformers need to adopt. We need to understand that even if this Congress passes some kind of permitting reform, which seems highly plausible to me, that needs to be the start of a sort of virtuous cycle of, as our event that you're so kindly complimenting referenced, a virtuous cycle of deregulating abundance, of sort of continuously reforming these institutions that have gotten too bureaucratic, too sclerotic, too unworkable. And just to come in for a landing, I think the problem, again, sort of like the bagel, is not that the vested interests have no point, and that there wouldn't be discontinuations and chaos introduced by hypothetically repealing NEPA tomorrow, but that so many of the vested interests, particularly from the sort of progressive and environmental nonprofit sector, see the sclerosis and see the bureaucracy as the goal. They see it as they see the sort of permitting regulatory regime as their opportunity to insert literally themselves, their organizations, into the what would otherwise be a more representative democratic political process, and they've totally hijacked all of those terms, whether it's or justice or representation, or sort of transparency when it comes to sort of planning and permitting and deploying infrastructure. What we have now is sort of an environmental and climate justice movement that claims to be representative and transparent and just, but is actually, I think, mostly serving its own interests, by declaring that, you know, when we pass the Inflation Reduction Act and make a national, democratically sort of validated commitment to build all of these new power plants and all of this transmission infrastructure and all of this transit infrastructure, that is the corrupt process, and the democratic, just, transparent process is NEPA compliance, sort of with stakeholders from the environmental movement. I think that is entirely backwards and self-serving, and so, yeah, again, where like the best way to pare back NEPA, very debatable. Very happy that we're having that debate, but like with everything bagel liberalism generally, we need to make sure that the sort of sclerosis and the added requirements, and the sort of standards for stakeholder engagement or whatever, become not just sort of an inevitable part of a sort of liberal, messy, democratic, slow, boring of hard boards process, but become the goal unto themselves.
All right. Well, I like that summary. That's good. That's solid. It's both provocative and conciliatory at the same time. We're splitting all the differences, bringing people into the big tent. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for being with us. Make sure and tell people where they can find you and Breakthrough out there on the internet.
Thanks, Richard. You can follow Breakthrough at the BTI on Twitter, while Twitter still exists. We also have a really great website, www.thebreakthrough.org, where you can read our reports, our analyses, our blogs, and our quarterly Breakthrough journal. I'm a Trembath on Twitter, while Twitter is still around, and you can read me at Breakthrough and sort of all over the place.
All right, excellent. Well, this is definitely not the last time we'll be talking about these issues, and as I'm sure you know, having listened to the podcast before, we do frequently feature stuff from Breakthrough Institute. So there will be more for everyone to listen to the future. But again, thanks for being with us, Alex.
Really great to be here, Richard. Thanks again.